Black man was thrown out by the billionaire CEO woman. Yet he returned with truth that broke her silence. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to the main character. Marcus Reed stood just outside the revolving glass doors of Hale Dynamics, the kind of skyscraper that pierced the clouds and reflected the city back at itself like a mirror of power, ambition, and money. At 32, Marcus was a black man who had learned early how to carry himself with quiet restraint, not because the world was gentle, but because it rarely was. He adjusted the cuff of his neatly pressed shirt, not expensive, not worn out, just clean and intentional, the kind of choice made by someone who measured life carefully. Inside, the lobby hummed with soft footsteps and muted conversations, marble floors gleaming under lights that probably cost more than his monthly rent, and as he stepped forward, he could feel the subtle shift in attention, the brief glances that assessed him before looking away. Marcus had walked nearly half a mile from the parking garage, passing luxury cars he'd only seen in magazines, not because he couldn't handle the distance, but because he preferred to arrive grounded, alert, present. This meeting mattered, even if no one inside knew why yet. He wasn't here to impress anyone with charm or bravado. He was here because the truth had a way of demanding space, even in rooms that believed they owned it. As the elevator doors closed around him and lifted him upward, Marcus thought about the early mornings that started before sunrise, the small apartment where his son still slept, the lunch packed in a brown paper bag, the quiet promise he made every day to be better than yesterday. Those miles driven to work, those dollars stretched until they made sense, had taught him patience, not submission. When the elevator opened onto the executive floor, the air felt different, cooler, quieter, heavier, as if sound itself needed permission to exist there. Assistants moved with purpose, heels clicking softly, tablets in hand, and Marcus waited, hands relaxed at his sides, eyes steady, aware that in places like this, silence often spoke louder than introductions. Somewhere beyond the frosted glass walls sat Victoria Hale, a billionaire CEO whose name alone carried weight in boardrooms across the country, a woman used to deciding outcomes before conversations even began. Marcus didn't rehearse what he would say. He never had. He believed that when the moment came, the truth would stand on its own, without decoration or apology. He took a slow breath, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart, and stepped forward, not knowing yet that this quiet entrance would be remembered long after louder voices were forgotten. Marcus stood near the reception desk longer than he expected, long enough to notice how the rhythm of the executive floor subtly shifted around him. Conversations lowering in volume, glances passing that lingered half a second too long before sliding away. No one said anything directly, but the message was clear in the way assistants tightened their posture and adjusted their grip on tablets, in the way a security guard's eyes flicked to his badge and back again, as if searching for confirmation that Marcus belonged there. He had felt this before, not once or twice, but often enough to recognize it without resentment. It was the quiet judgment that came before any words were spoken, the kind that formed conclusions without evidence. An assistant finally approached, her smile professional but measured, asking him to wait just a moment, and Marcus nodded, his expression calm, his hands still relaxed at his sides. He listened as she announced his name through a headset, watched her pause, then repeat it more slowly, as if pronunciation might change its meaning. While he waited, Marcus took in the details of the space, the abstract art lining the walls, the muted colors chosen to suggest sophistication rather than warmth, the faint scent of expensive coffee drifting from somewhere deeper inside the floor. Everything here was designed to signal success, to remind visitors exactly who held authority. Across the glass corridor, he could see movement inside a conference room, silhouettes around a long table, one figure standing at the head, unmistakably composed, unmistakably in control. That was Victoria Hale. Even from a distance, her presence carried weight, not loud or dramatic, but sharp, efficient, final. Marcus had read about her rise in business journals during late nights after his son fell asleep, articles that praised her decisiveness and fearlessness, stories that rarely mentioned who was pushed aside along the way. As he waited, fragments of conversation floated past him, phrases about quarterly numbers, brand perception, strategic alignment, none of which included him, yet all of which seemed to frame how he was being silently evaluated. To them, he was an interruption, an unknown variable, a man whose appearance did not match the polished symmetry of the floor he stood on. Marcus shifted his weight slightly, not from discomfort, but from awareness, conscious of how easily assumptions filled the silence. He remembered standing in other rooms like this, smaller rooms, louder rooms, rooms where respect had to be earned twice, once for competence and once for simply existing. A junior executive walked by, glanced at him, then leaned toward another colleague, whispering something that ended in a quick, restrained smile. Marcus did not look away. He had learned that lowering his gaze only fed the story others invented for him. Instead, he focused on his breathing, steady and even, reminding himself why he was here. This was not about approval or recognition. It was about timing. Somewhere behind those walls, decisions were being made that affected real lives, including his own, and the truth he carried did not need to announce itself loudly to be powerful. It only needed the right moment. The assistant returned, her tone polite but distant, informing him that there had been a slight change in schedule and that Ms. Hale would see him shortly, if time allowed. Marcus thanked her, genuinely, because courtesy cost nothing, and resumed his place, aware that every minute he stood there, unseen yet visible, tested his patience and theirs. He could feel the unspoken question hanging in the air. What was a man like him doing here? And he let it remain unanswered. For now, the glass doors to the conference room finally opened, and the assistant gestured for Marcus to step inside, her expression carefully neutral, as if she were escorting a risk rather than a guest. The room fell quiet in a way that felt rehearsed, 12 executives seated around a polished table, turning their attention toward him at once, eyes sharp with curiosity and calculation. At the head of the table stood Victoria Hale, tall, composed, her presence commanding without effort, dressed in a tailored suit that looked like it belonged exactly where she stood. She glanced at Marcus briefly, not with interest, but with assessment, the kind that sorted people into categories within seconds. Before Marcus could introduce himself, she spoke, her voice calm but edged with impatience, asking why the meeting had been interrupted. An executive murmured his name, explaining that he claimed to have information relevant to the company, and Victoria's gaze returned to Marcus, this time lingering just long enough to make the imbalance of power unmistakable. She asked him to state his purpose, her tone suggesting that time was a luxury she did not intend to waste. Marcus spoke clearly and respectfully, explaining that he had reached out multiple times through proper channels and had finally been granted this brief opportunity. He kept his words measured, choosing clarity over persuasion, but before he could finish his second sentence, Victoria raised a hand, stopping him mid-thought. She asked him where he worked, not as a genuine question, but as a filter. When Marcus answered honestly, naming a small firm far removed from the corporate weight of the room, a faint smile touched her lips, not warm, not cruel, but dismissive. She commented that Hale Dynamics received inquiries like this every week, from people who believed proximity to information equaled relevance. A few executives shifted in their seats, some glancing down, others watching closely, sensing the direction the moment was taking. Marcus remained standing, aware that he had not been offered a seat, aware that the room had already decided where he belonged. He attempted once more to explain why his presence mattered, emphasizing that what he knew concerned decisions currently in motion, but Victoria cut him off again, her voice firmer now, stating that if he had something truly valuable, it would have surfaced through established channels long before reaching her boardroom. She questioned his understanding of the company's scale, its legal structure, its safeguards, speaking as though she were educating rather than listening. The words were not loud, but they landed with precision, each one reinforcing the idea that Marcus was out of place. An executive near the far end of the table let out a quiet breath that might have been a laugh, quickly masked as a cough, and the sound echoed, louder than it should have in the stillness. Victoria turned slightly toward her assistant, and remarked that security should be more careful about screening visitors, that interruptions like this undermined efficiency. The sentence was delivered casually, but its meaning was unmistakable. Marcus felt the heat of attention shift, not toward his message, but toward his presence, his posture, his right to occupy the space. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply said that he understood her position, that he hoped she would remember this moment later. That was when Victoria finally looked directly at him, her expression sharpening, asking if that was a threat. Marcus shook his head slowly, clarifying that it was not a threat, only a statement of fact, but the distinction was already lost. She dismissed him with a short nod, signaling to security, and turned back to the board, resuming the meeting as if he were no longer there. As Marcus was escorted toward the door, he caught a final glimpse of the room, the polished table, the confident faces, the certainty that filled the space, and he understood that the judgment had never been about his information. It had been about who was allowed to speak and who was expected to leave quietly. Marcus walked out of the conference room without resistance, his steps steady, his shoulders relaxed, even as the weight of the moment pressed quietly against his chest. The executive floor seemed longer on the way out, the glass walls reflecting his image back at him in fragments. A man moving forward while conversations resumed behind closed doors as if he had never been there. The security guard accompanied him at a respectful distance, not aggressive, not apologetic, simply performing a duty that required no explanation. As the elevator doors opened, Marcus stepped inside alone, the soft chimes signaling descent sounding louder than before, and as the doors slid shut, the polished confidence of the executive floor disappeared from view. He let out a slow breath he did not realize he had been holding, not from anger, but from clarity. The meeting had gone exactly as he suspected it might, not because his information lacked value, but because it had come from someone who did not fit the room's expectations. As the elevator descended floor by floor, Marcus thought about the moment Victoria Hale had cut him off, about the way her eyes had moved past him as if he were already history, and he felt no urge to replay the scene differently. He had said what he needed to say. He had been seen, even if not heard. When the elevator reached the lobby, the doors opened to the familiar hum of the building's lower levels, people moving with purpose, phones pressed to ears, laughter mixing with footsteps, and Marcus stepped out into the flow without hesitation. No one stopped him now. No one questioned his presence. Outside, the city greeted him with the muted roar of traffic and the steady pulse of midday life, sunlight reflecting off steel and glass, the air warmer than it had been inside. He walked past the revolving doors and onto the sidewalk, feeling the ground solid beneath his feet, grounding in a way that marble floors never could. For a moment, he stood there, watching people hurry past, each one carrying their own concerns, their own unseen battles, and he reminded himself that this was not an ending. It was a pause. He reached into his pocket and checked his phone, a notification from his son's school reminding parents about an upcoming science fair, a small, ordinary message that brought his focus back to what truly mattered. Marcus smiled faintly, not because the day had gone well, but because it had gone honestly. He began the walk back toward the parking garage, the distance familiar now, the rhythm of his steps matching the thoughts in his head. He replayed the words Victoria had used, not with bitterness, but with analysis, understanding how certainty often blinded those who wielded it. The truth he carried was still intact, unchanged by dismissal, waiting for the moment when it could no longer be ignored. As he drove away from the building, the skyscraper shrinking in his rearview mirror, Marcus felt a quiet resolve settle in. He did not need their approval to validate what he knew. He had learned long ago that some doors only opened after they were slammed shut. Back at his apartment later that evening, the familiar sounds of home greeted him, the television murmuring softly, his son's laughter echoing from the living room as they talked about school and homework and dinner plans. Marcus listened, present, engaged, the earlier tension replaced by something steadier. He tucked his son into bed. That night with the same promise he made every day, that he would always show up, that he would always stand firm, even when the world tried to tell him he did not belong. Lying awake afterward, staring at the ceiling, Marcus thought again of the boardroom, of Victoria Hale's certainty, and he knew that certainty had cracks. He did not rush to fill them. He would wait. The truth, he understood, did not need force. It needed time. The days that followed passed without any message from Hale Dynamics, and the absence of response spoke louder than any rejection letter ever could. Marcus returned to his routine, waking before sunrise, preparing breakfast while the city was still quiet, packing lunches, tying shoes, listening to his son talk about spelling tests and science projects with the seriousness only children could muster. He went to work, handled his responsibilities with the same focus he always had, and in the evenings reviewed documents at his small kitchen table after his son fell asleep, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound keeping him company. To anyone watching from the outside, nothing had changed, but inside, Marcus was listening carefully to the silence. He had learned long ago that silence was rarely empty. It was often a sign of denial, of avoidance, of people hoping a problem would fade if ignored long enough. He did not follow up with calls or emails. He did not remind anyone of his existence. He let the quiet stretch, knowing that impatience would only weaken his position. Each morning, headlines crossed his screen about market shifts and industry speculation, articles praising Hale Dynamics for bold moves and decisive leadership, and Marcus read them with a measured eye, recognizing patterns others missed. The silence from Victoria Hale's world was deliberate, and that told him more than a dozen meetings ever could. At night, as he sat beside his son's bed, listening to steady breathing, Marcus thought about what it meant to be dismissed, not just from a room, but from consideration, and how often that dismissal had followed him through life. He did not internalize it. He cataloged it. Silence had taught him resilience, patience, and the importance of timing. Across the city, Victoria Hale moved through her days with precision, meetings stacked back to back, decisions signed off with a practiced hand, the encounter with Marcus, fading into the background of more pressing concerns. To her, he had been an interruption, an anomaly quickly resolved, and she rarely thought about him again. That was exactly what Marcus expected. People with power often believed their certainty protected them from oversight, and that belief was where their blind spots lived. Weeks passed, and the silence continued, uninterrupted, unchallenged, until subtle changes began to ripple beneath the surface. Marcus noticed shifts in public filings, language that hinted at confidence without transparency, strategies built on assumptions rather than verification. He made notes, not out of excitement, but out of responsibility. This was never about proving anyone wrong. It was about preventing consequences that would not stop at boardroom doors. The quiet became heavier, layered with tension only visible to those who knew where to look. Marcus felt it during his commute, in the way news anchors spoke a little more cautiously about the market, in the way analysts hedged their statements. Still, no one reached out to him. No one acknowledged his earlier warning. And Marcus did nothing. He did not rush to remind them. He did not attempt to force his way back into spaces that had closed ranks against him. Instead, he continued to live his life deliberately, attending parent-teacher meetings, cooking dinner, helping with homework, anchoring himself in what was real and immediate. The silence was his ally now. It gave the truth room to grow heavier, more undeniable. Late one evening, as rain tapped softly against the windows, Marcus closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, feeling the familiar calm that came when preparation met patience. He knew the moment would come when silence would no longer serve those who relied on it, when questions would demand answers, and when certainty would crack under its own weight. Until then, he remained where he was, unseen but ready, understanding that the most powerful response was often not spoken at all. The world assumed he had disappeared. Marcus knew better. He was simply waiting. Life settled into a quiet rhythm that few people would ever notice. And that was exactly how Marcus preferred it. Each morning followed the same pattern, the alarm sounding before dawn, the apartment still wrapped in darkness as he moved through the kitchen preparing breakfast, the smell of toast and coffee filling the small space. His son shuffled in sleepily, hair uncombed, asking questions that drifted between curiosity and comfort, and Marcus answered each one with patience, knowing these moments mattered more than any boardroom exchange ever could. After dropping his son at school, Marcus drove to work, the familiar route stretching ahead of him, mile after mile of ordinary roads that grounded him in reality. At his job, he was respected but not celebrated, trusted but rarely praised, the kind of man people relied on quietly without fully recognizing his depth. He completed his tasks efficiently, spoke when necessary, listened more than he talked, and left each day without fanfare. In the evenings, he returned home, cooked dinner, helped with homework, and listened as his son recounted stories from the day, the small victories and frustrations that defined a child's world. These routines were not distractions from his purpose, they were reminders of it. Beneath the surface of this ordinary life, Marcus continued to prepare, reviewing documents late into the night, cross-checking details, confirming patterns that others dismissed as coincidence. He did not rush. He did not speculate publicly. He understood that accuracy mattered more than urgency. Across town, Victoria Hale's days remained packed with meetings and decisions, her calendar a mosaic of commitments that left little room for reflection. She moved confidently through her world, surrounded by people who reinforced her authority, each nod and agreement strengthening her belief that the situation was under control. Reports crossed her desk daily, filtered and refined by layers of executives who knew what she expected to hear. Somewhere deep within the data lay inconsistencies, subtle enough to be overlooked, yet significant enough to matter. Those inconsistencies were what Marcus had seen. Those inconsistencies were what no one wanted to acknowledge. Weeks turned into months, and the gap between perception and reality slowly widened. Marcus noticed changes in tone during earnings calls, careful wording replacing bold declarations, confidence hedged with qualifiers. Analysts began asking sharper questions. Still, no one called him. Still, the silence held. Marcus did not mistake this for victory or validation. He understood it as inevitability approaching. One evening, after his son had fallen asleep, Marcus sat alone at the kitchen table, papers spread neatly before him, the soft glow of a desk lamp illuminating lines of numbers that told a story few could read. He thought about how easily he could have forced his way back into the conversation earlier, how anger or pride might have pushed him to demand acknowledgement. He was grateful he had not. His life had taught him that reacting too soon often robbed the truth of its full weight. He remembered his own father, a man who had worked long hours and spoken few words, who had taught him that strength was measured not by how loudly one spoke, but by how firmly one stood when it mattered. That lesson echoed now. Marcus stood when others rushed. He waited when others demanded. Outside, the city continued its restless motion, unaware of the quiet preparation happening within a modest apartment. Marcus closed his folder, set it aside, and turned off the lamp, allowing the room to return to darkness. He felt no anxiety, no rush, only a steady sense of readiness. The truth was no longer just information. It was timing, context, consequence. And when it surfaced, it would not need embellishment. It would speak for itself. Marcus lay down that night with the same calm certainty he carried each day, knowing that silence was nearing its limit, and when it finally broke, it would not be him asking to be heard. It would be the world realizing it had already been warned. The first clear sign arrived quietly, tucked between headlines and market commentary, a small article that most readers would skim past without pause. Marcus noticed it immediately. A subsidiary linked to Hale Dynamics had adjusted its forecasts, citing unforeseen variables and temporary recalibration. The language was cautious, almost apologetic, a sharp contrast to the confident tone that had dominated previous reports. Marcus read the piece twice, then set his phone down, feeling a familiar tightening in his chest, not fear, but recognition. This was the beginning of what he had tried to explain months earlier. Over the following days, similar notes appeared, analysts revising expectations, commentators using phrases like uncertainty and exposure where they once said growth and dominance. Marcus followed each development carefully, cross-referencing details late at night after his son was asleep, confirming that the patterns he had identified were no longer theoretical. They were becoming visible. The truth was surfacing, not dramatically, but persistently, like pressure building behind a wall. At work, colleagues chatted casually about the news, some expressing surprise, others brushing it off as normal fluctuation, and Marcus listened without contributing, aware that understanding arrived. At different speeds for different people. He did not correct them. He did not claim foresight. He kept his focus where it belonged. Meanwhile, inside Hale Dynamics, the atmosphere had begun to shift. Meetings stretched longer. Questions multiplied. Reports that once sailed through approval were now examined more closely, margins scrutinized, assumptions challenged. Victoria Hale maintained her composure, her confidence intact on the surface, but even she could feel the subtle change. The certainty that once filled every room no longer moved unchallenged. Advisors spoke more carefully. Legal teams requested additional reviews. Somewhere beneath the polished structure, unease had taken root. Victoria dismissed it publicly, framing the adjustments as strategic refinement, but privately, she felt a familiar discomfort, the kind that came when control was no longer absolute. She did not think of Marcus Reed. Not yet. To her, the situation was still manageable, still within the bounds of authority and expertise. She trusted her systems, her people, her instincts. Marcus continued his routine, grounding himself in everyday responsibilities, attending his son's science fair, applauding as small projects were presented with oversized pride, laughing at mistakes that mattered deeply only to children. These moments kept him anchored, reminding him why he had chosen patience over confrontation. Late one evening, as rain streaked the windows and the city lights blurred beyond the glass, Marcus received a message from an old contact, someone who worked close enough to corporate structures to sense tension, but far enough to speak freely. The message was brief, cautious, asking if Marcus was still paying attention to Hale Dynamics. Marcus replied simply that he was. He did not offer details. He did not ask questions. He understood that when people reached out after silence, it was because something had shifted. The following week, the stock dipped slightly, not enough to cause panic, but enough to draw attention. Financial news programs debated causes, experts offering competing explanations, and Marcus listened, recognizing fragments of the truth woven through speculation. He organized his notes, aligning timelines, reinforcing evidence, ensuring that when the moment arrived, there would be no gaps, no doubts, no room for dismissal. He did not feel vindicated. He felt responsible. The truth, once released, would have consequences beyond reputations and balance sheets. It would affect employees, investors, families. Marcus understood that weight. He had always understood it. As he turned off his laptop that night, he looked around his modest apartment, the quiet proof of a life built on consistency and care, and he knew that the silence that had once protected others was now working against them. The truth was no longer waiting in the shadows. It was stepping into view, piece by piece, and soon, ignoring it would no longer be an option. Inside Hale Dynamics, the atmosphere no longer carried the effortless certainty that had once defined it. Victoria Hale sat at the head of another long conference table, listening as her senior team presented updates that sounded confident on the surface but felt increasingly cautious beneath the words. Slides filled with carefully chosen language appeared on the screen, projections adjusted, timelines extended, risks reframed as temporary challenges. Victoria nodded, asked pointed questions, and maintained her composed exterior, yet each answer seemed to raise another concern rather than settle it. The room felt tighter now, conversations more guarded, pauses lingering just a moment too long before someone spoke. She noticed it in the way her advisors avoided absolute statements, in the way legal counsel requested additional reviews, in the way finance teams double-checked figures that would have sailed through approval months earlier. None of it amounted to a crisis, but together, it formed a pattern that refused to be ignored. After the meeting ended, Victoria remained seated, staring at the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the glass reflecting her image back at her, sharp and controlled as always. She prided herself on anticipation, on seeing problems before they emerged, yet something about this situation unsettled her. It was not just the numbers. It was the feeling that a piece of the picture had been missed. In the days that followed, she reviewed reports late into the evening, reading between lines written by people trained to reassure her. She called in department heads for private discussions, pressing for clarity, expecting decisive answers. What she received instead were explanations layered with assumptions, confidence built on projections rather than certainty. Victoria began to feel a subtle but persistent tension, the kind that crept in when control slipped quietly rather than dramatically. She did not voice it. Leaders like her did not reveal doubt. Still, her sleep grew lighter, her thoughts returning to the same unresolved questions. One afternoon, While reviewing archive communications, she came across a brief note from months earlier, flagged but never revisited, mentioning an unsolicited warning that had been deemed irrelevant. The name attached to it stirred a faint recognition. Marcus Reed. For a moment, she could picture him standing in her boardroom, calm, measured, out of place by design rather than accident. She dismissed the thought quickly, reminding herself that countless people claimed insight without understanding scale or complexity. Yet the memory lingered longer than she expected. Around her, the company continued to function, employees working diligently, products moving forward, public confidence largely intact. But Victoria could feel the strain beneath the surface, the effort required to keep everything aligned. She convened another meeting, this time smaller, more selective, probing deeper into the areas now drawing scrutiny. The answers remained incomplete. Outside the company, analysts began to sharpen their commentary, investors asking more direct questions during calls, journalists framing stories with cautious undertones. Victoria responded with polished statements, reaffirming strategy, emphasizing long-term vision, projecting strength. Publicly, she remained unshaken. Privately, she felt the first hairline fractures form in the certainty she had always trusted. Meanwhile, Marcus Reed continued his life quietly, unaware of the specific conversations unfolding within Hale Dynamics, but fully aware that the moment he had anticipated was drawing closer. He followed developments with care, noting how pressure changed behavior, how people accustomed to control reacted when it slipped. He did not take satisfaction in this shift. He felt the weight of it. Back at Hale Dynamics, Victoria stood alone in her office one evening, city lights flickering below, documents spread across her desk, each one answering a question while raising another. She thought again of the man she had dismissed, not with regret yet, but with curiosity. The possibility unsettled her. If he had seen what her teams had missed, the implications extended beyond pride or perception. They touched the foundation of her authority. Victoria closed the file and straightened, reminding herself who she was and what she had built. Still, as she turned off the lights and left the office, the silence she had once relied on felt different now. It no longer protected certainty. It magnified doubt. And for the first time in a long while, Victoria Hale realized that ignoring a voice did not mean it had nothing to say. The message reached Marcus on an ordinary afternoon, arriving without ceremony. A short email from an unfamiliar address requesting a brief conversation. Regarding Hale Dynamics, there was no apology in the wording, no acknowledgement of the past, only a neutral tone that suggested urgency wrapped in professionalism. Marcus read it once, then again, feeling no surge of triumph, no sense of vindication, only a quiet confirmation that the moment he had prepared for had arrived. He did not respond immediately. He finished his workday, picked up his son from school, listened attentively to a story about a group project and a disagreement that ended in compromise, and cooked dinner as usual. Later that evening, after his son was asleep, Marcus replied with a simple acceptance, proposing a time that fit his schedule. He did not negotiate terms. He did not ask who would attend. He understood that when silence broke this way, it was not an invitation to debate, but a request born of necessity. 2 days later, Marcus found himself once again approaching the familiar glass exterior of Hale Dynamics. The building unchanged, its presence still imposing, yet the feeling inside him was different. He walked the same path from the parking garage, his pace unhurried, his posture steady, aware that nothing about his appearance had changed, and yet everything about the circumstances had. Inside, the lobby hummed with the same controlled energy, but this time, when he gave his name at reception, the response was immediate. The assistant's demeanor shifted subtly, her tone more attentive, her instructions clear. Marcus was escorted directly to a private conference room, smaller than the boardroom, but no less refined, and invited to take a seat. No one kept him waiting long. When Victoria Hale entered, she carried herself with the same authority as before, but Marcus noticed the difference in her eyes. Where there had once been dismissal, there was now focus. She greeted him formally, thanking him for coming, and took a seat across from him, the table between them no longer a symbol of hierarchy, but a boundary of mutual awareness. She did not reference their previous meeting. Neither did Marcus. She spoke first, explaining that recent developments had prompted a reassessment of certain assumptions, that new perspectives were being considered. Her words were careful, measured, chosen to preserve control while opening space for dialogue. Marcus listened without interruption, allowing her to finish before responding. When he spoke, his voice was calm, respectful, unchanged by the shift in power. He did not recount how he had been dismissed. He did not remind her of the past. He simply acknowledged the developments and stated that the concerns he had raised earlier had progressed as expected. Victoria asked questions now, direct ones, about specifics, about timelines, about implications. Marcus answered each one clearly, drawing from the preparation he had refined over months of silence. The conversation unfolded without tension, without confrontation, yet beneath the surface, both understood what was happening. The dynamic had shifted. Victoria was no longer controlling the flow unchallenged. She was listening. At one point, she paused, studying Marcus as if seeing him for the first time, and asked why he had not pushed harder to be heard earlier. Marcus considered the question carefully before answering that some truths needed time to become visible, and that forcing them too early often led to resistance rather than understanding. Victoria nodded slowly, absorbing the response. The meeting concluded with no dramatic resolution, no declarations, only an agreement to continue the discussion, to involve additional parties, to examine the information thoroughly. As Marcus stood to leave, Victoria thanked him again, this time without formality, her tone sincere, though restrained. Marcus returned the courtesy and exited the room, aware that this return was not about recognition or reversal. It was about responsibility. As he stepped back into the city, the building behind him unchanged in appearance but altered in meaning, Marcus felt the familiar calm settle in once more. He had not come back to reclaim dignity. He had never lost it. He had come back because the truth had finally created space for itself, and now it would be heard. The follow-up meeting was scheduled quickly, no longer tentative, but deliberate, and this time the room was fuller, populated by executives whose expressions revealed concern carefully masked as professionalism. Marcus arrived early, not out of obligation, but out of habit, taking a seat near the end of the table and laying out his documents with methodical precision. When Victoria Hale entered, the conversation softened, attention shifting toward her instinctively, yet the energy in the room felt different now, less absolute, more expectant. She opened the meeting with a concise overview of recent developments, acknowledging challenges without dramatizing them, then turned the focus to Marcus, inviting him to present his findings. The invitation was direct, unqualified, and unmistakable. Marcus stood, not to command the room, but to engage it, and began explaining what he had seen months earlier, outlining timelines, connections, and assumptions that no longer held. He spoke without embellishment, his tone steady, his language clear, allowing the information to carry its own weight. As he moved through each point, the room grew quieter, pens paused, eyes shifted from screens to him, and questions formed not from skepticism, but from realization. When executives interrupted, it was not to dismiss, but to clarify, to test the implications of what he was saying. Marcus welcomed the questions, answering each one with patience, reinforcing how early indicators had been overlooked in favor of confidence. Victoria listened intently, occasionally asking for elaboration, her expression controlled but focused, absorbing details that aligned uncomfortably with concerns she had struggled to articulate. As the discussion deepened, the reality became harder to ignore. Decisions once defended as strategic now appeared rushed. Safeguards assumed to be sufficient showed gaps. The truth unfolded not as an accusation, but as a mirror, reflecting the consequences of certainty unchecked. One executive leaned back, exhaling slowly. Another adjusted his notes, the atmosphere shifting from defense to reckoning. Marcus did not take satisfaction in this. He remained grounded, reminding the group that the objective was not blame, but correction, that acknowledging missteps early could prevent greater fallout. Victoria nodded, recognizing the restraint in his approach, the absence of ego where others might have demanded recognition. At one point, she addressed the room, stating plainly that they would need to reassess recent decisions, that external review might be necessary, and that transparency would be critical moving forward. The words carried weight, not because they were dramatic, but because they marked a departure from her usual certainty. The room absorbed the directive in silence. As the meeting drew to a close, Victoria asked Marcus to stay behind briefly. The others filed out, conversation subdued, leaving the two of them alone in the room once more. She thanked him for his clarity, acknowledging that the information had been difficult to hear but necessary. Marcus responded simply, stating that his intention had always been to ensure awareness, not to challenge authority. Victoria studied him for a moment, then admitted that she had dismissed him too quickly the first time, that assumptions had influenced her judgment. She did not apologize outright, but the admission carried its own weight. Marcus accepted it without comment, understanding that accountability often began with recognition rather than words. When he left the building that day, the city felt unchanged, traffic flowing, people moving through their routines, unaware of the shifts taking place behind glass walls. Yet Marcus knew something fundamental had changed. The truth was no longer theoretical or ignored. It had been spoken, examined, and accepted. As he drove home, he thought not about what had been proven, but about what came next, the responsibility that followed being heard. That evening, as he helped his son with homework and listened to laughter fill the apartment, Marcus felt a quiet resolve deepen within him. He had not returned to reclaim respect. He had returned to deliver the truth. And now that it had landed, the silence that once protected certainty had finally been broken. The days after the meeting carried a weight that could not be measured in numbers or headlines, a quiet heaviness that settled over Hale Dynamics as reality adjusted itself around newly acknowledged truths. Decisions were paused, initiatives reviewed, conversations shifted in tone, and what had once been driven by confidence now moved forward with caution. Victoria Hale felt the change more acutely than anyone else. Alone in her office late one evening, she stared at the city lights below, realizing that for the first time in years, she did not have a ready answer for everything. The silence in the room felt unfamiliar, no longer a space of control, but one of reflection. She replayed the meeting in her mind, Marcus Reed standing calmly as others questioned assumptions she had once defended without hesitation. What unsettled her most was not that he had been right, but that she had dismissed him so easily the first time. That realization pressed against her pride in ways no market fluctuation ever had. In subsequent meetings, Victoria spoke less and listened more, allowing discussions to unfold without steering them prematurely. Executives noticed the change, unsure whether it signaled weakness or evolution. When questions arose that lacked immediate answers, Victoria did not fill the gaps with certainty. She allowed the silence to remain, and in doing so, acknowledged what she did not yet know. Meanwhile, Marcus returned to his life with little outward change. He continued his routine, work, parenting, preparation, yet he felt the shift as well. Emails arrived more frequently now, requests for clarification, invitations to review findings, opportunities to contribute where he had once been excluded. He responded thoughtfully, never rushing, never overstepping, understanding that influence carried responsibility. He did not seek recognition. He sought alignment. At home, his son noticed that Marcus seemed quieter, more reflective, asking one evening if something was wrong. Marcus smiled and assured him that nothing was wrong, that sometimes doing the right thing simply required patience. The boy accepted the answer, content, and returned to his homework, unaware of the larger lessons unfolding around them. Back at Hale Dynamics, Victoria convened a final internal review before broader changes would be announced. As the discussion progressed, she found herself hesitating before speaking, measuring her words carefully. When a junior executive asked a question that challenged a long-held assumption, the room went still, waiting for Victoria to respond. For the first time, she did not correct him or redirect the conversation. She paused, then admitted that the question was valid and deserved examination. The moment passed quietly, but its significance was undeniable. Authority no longer demanded silence. It allowed space. Later that evening, Victoria drafted a statement to stakeholders, transparent but controlled, acknowledging challenges and outlining corrective steps. As she read it back, she recognized the subtle shift in her own voice, less declarative, more accountable. It was not an admission of defeat. It was an acknowledgement of reality. Across the city, Marcus closed his laptop after reviewing the draft, noting its sincerity. He did not feel satisfaction. He felt relief. The truth had not only been heard, it had changed behavior. That was all he had hoped for. As night settled in and the city quieted, both Marcus and Victoria sat separately with their thoughts, connected by an unspoken understanding forged through tension and restraint. The silence that once protected certainty had been replaced by a deeper, more honest quiet, one that allowed reflection rather than denial. And in that silence, both of them understood that leadership, real leadership, was not about never being wrong, but about having the courage to listen when the truth finally spoke. The announcement came quietly, released in measured language that avoided drama, yet carried undeniable weight, and within hours its impact rippled outward through markets, media, and internal corridors alike. Hale Dynamics acknowledged miscalculations, outlined corrective steps, and committed to oversight that would reshape its direction. There were no sensational headlines at first, just careful analysis, cautious reactions, and a gradual realization that something fundamental had shifted. Inside the company, reactions varied. Some executives felt exposed, others relieved, many unsettled. The culture that had once rewarded certainty now demanded accountability, and not everyone adapted easily. Victoria Hale stood at the center of that shift, absorbing the consequences of decisions she had once defended without hesitation. She addressed her leadership team directly, not with authority alone, but with candor, acknowledging that her confidence had, at times, closed doors that should have remained open. The admission was not dramatic, but it was transformative. For some, it was the first time they had heard her speak without armor. For Victoria, it marked the quiet collapse of a version of herself she had long relied on, the one who believed strength meant never reconsidering. She felt the loss of that certainty keenly, like a familiar structure dismantled piece by piece, leaving space that felt both terrifying and necessary. Outside that world, Marcus Reed watched the developments unfold with the same steady focus that had guided him from the beginning. He followed the coverage, read the analyses, and noted how often commentators framed the shift as unexpected, as if warnings had not existed all along. He did not correct the narrative. He understood that public stories often lagged behind truth. What mattered was that change was happening. Requests for his insight continued to arrive, and Marcus responded selectively, ensuring that his involvement remained purposeful rather than performative. He declined invitations that centered on visibility rather than impact, choosing instead to contribute where his voice could help prevent repetition of past mistakes. At home, life continued with comforting normalcy. His son practiced spelling words at the kitchen table, asked questions about fairness and honesty prompted by schoolyard disagreements, and Marcus answered thoughtfully, aware that these conversations echoed larger truths playing out beyond their walls. One evening, after another long day, Marcus received a brief message from Victoria herself, thanking him for his integrity and acknowledging that his restraint had forced a reckoning she had not known she needed. The message was not an apology, nor was it a request. It was an acknowledgement, plain and unguarded. Marcus read it carefully, then replied with a short note affirming his hope that the changes underway would protect people beyond the boardroom. He did not mention the past. It no longer required revisiting. Across the city, Victoria sat alone in her office after sending the message, the building quieter now, the city lights less distant than before. She reflected on the moment she had dismissed Marcus, how easily she had equated authority with accuracy, how quickly she had silenced a voice that challenged her assumptions. The recognition did not come with shame so much as clarity. Power, she realized, had insulated her from listening, and in that insulation, she had grown vulnerable. The realization humbled her more than any public criticism ever could. In the days that followed, Hale Dynamics began the slow work of rebuilding trust, internally and externally. It was not glamorous. It required patience, transparency, and a willingness to remain uncomfortable. Victoria embraced the discomfort, understanding now that it was not a threat, but a signal of growth. Marcus continued forward as he always had, grounded, deliberate, carrying no desire for recognition, only a commitment to truth. As weeks passed, the initial shock faded, replaced by a new equilibrium shaped by lessons learned the hard way. The silence that once protected arrogance had fully dissolved, replaced by conversations that demanded listening. And in that shift, both Marcus and Victoria stood changed, not as adversaries, but as reflections of what happens when truth is allowed to dismantle pride and rebuild understanding in its place. Time moved forward quietly, without the sharp turns or dramatic closures people often expected from stories like this. Hale Dynamics stabilized, not through bold declarations, but through deliberate correction, slower growth, and an internal culture that no longer treated certainty as a substitute for truth. Victoria Hale remained at the helm, though the way she led had changed in ways few headlines could capture. She no longer spoke first in every meeting. She no longer equated silence with agreement. She listened, not as a tactic, but as a discipline learned the hard way. Those closest to her noticed it most, the subtle pauses before decisions, the questions asked without defensiveness, the willingness to let others finish even when she already had an answer forming. The company did not become perfect, but it became more honest, and that shift echoed outward in ways that mattered more than stock prices alone. Marcus Reed faded naturally from the center of attention, exactly as he intended. His role had never been to remain visible, only to ensure that what needed to be seen was no longer ignored. He continued working, continued parenting, continued living a life defined by consistency rather than consequence. On weekends, he took his son to the park, watched him learn to ride a bike without training wheels, jogging alongside until confidence replaced hesitation. When his son finally pedaled forward on his own, Marcus slowed, letting go without ceremony, smiling as he watched independence take shape in real time. The moment felt familiar. Letting go always did. Occasionally, Marcus received updates from former contacts, small notes about how systems had changed, how voices were being heard earlier now, how warnings no longer had to come from the margins to be taken seriously. He read them quietly, grateful but detached, knowing that the truest impact of his actions would likely never be traced back to him by name. That was fine. He had never needed the credit to know the outcome mattered. One afternoon, months later, Marcus crossed paths with Victoria by chance at a public forum on corporate responsibility. There was no announcement, no spotlight, just two people recognizing each other across a crowded room. Victoria approached him briefly, thanked him again for what he had done, then added something she had not said before, that the most difficult lesson had not been accepting she was wrong, but realizing how easily she had dismissed someone because he did not fit her expectations. Marcus listened, nodded once, and replied that growth often arrived through discomfort, whether invited or not. They parted without ceremony, without promises, without unfinished business. Each walked away carrying what they needed from the exchange. As seasons changed, the story receded from public memory, replaced by newer crises and louder narratives. Yet its effects remained embedded in quieter choices made every day. Marcus continued to wake before sunrise, continued to prepare breakfast, continued to teach his son through example rather than instruction that dignity did not require permission and truth did not require volume. Victoria continued to lead with a sharper awareness of her blind spots, understanding now that power unchallenged was not strength, but risk. Neither of them framed what had happened as victory or defeat. It had been neither. It had been a correction. In the end, there was no final speech, no symbolic handshake, no moment where everything resolved neatly. There was only forward motion shaped by lessons learned, silence transformed from a weapon into a space for listening, and the quiet understanding that real change rarely announces itself. It settles in slowly, reshaping decisions, altering paths, and leaving behind a different kind of legacy, one built not on who spoke loudest, but on who was finally willing to hear.